Kansas Territory, October 1871, the wind pushed hard against the rotting boards of the barn, howling like it wanted in. Inside, Savannah Nolan pressed her back against the cold wall, arms wrapped around her two children as they slept, curled against her sides like pups. Dirt clung to her skirts, and her hands were raw from the week's walk that had ended here, this half-collapsed barn on the edge of nowhere. They had nothing left. Savannah had not eaten in 2 days. Her daughter, 9-year-old Nora, had stopped asking for food yesterday. Her son, 4-year-old Nolan, had cried through the night and then gone too quiet. She kept checking to make sure his chest still rose beneath his patched coat. The barn had once belonged to a farmstead, but the house was long gone. Only scorched beams and crumbled stone remained. Savannah had stumbled across it after the wagon driver she'd trusted to take them west left them behind in the middle of nowhere. He had taken the last of her money and her bag of food, promising to return. He hadn't. Now she sat in the bones of a stranger's barn, waiting for anything to change. The storm had rolled in fast, and cold rains slipped through gaps in the roof. Savannah curled tighter around her children, trying to shield them, but all she could do was whisper promises she was no longer sure she could keep. "I will find a way," she breathed, voice cracking. "I swear I will." She did not know that help was already on the way. A quarter mile out, a lone rider slowed his chestnut gelding. Jackson McAllister had noticed smoke earlier, thin and gray, too small for a proper fire. He had circled around, rifle across his saddle, watching from the ridge above. The barn was ruined, no one should be there, but he had seen movement. A woman huddled in the dark like a ghost, and 2 children beside her. He nudged his horse down the slope. Savannah heard the hoofbeats and stiffened. She reached for the broken pitchfork she had found near the door. Her legs shook as she stood, placing herself between the children and the entrance. Jackson stopped just outside. "Ma'am," his voice was calm, deep, careful. She did not answer. "I saw smoke, thought maybe someone was in trouble." Still nothing. "I'll stay right here," he added, both hands lifted from his reins. "Just wanted to check you were all right." Her voice came low, hoarse. "We are not." Jackson waited. The woman stepped forward into a shaft of gray light, and he saw her for the first time, thin, bone-tired, her dress soaked through and mud-stained, but her eyes steady and sharp with fear. "There's children," she said. "I figured I can help." "How?" "I have food in my saddlebag. Some jerky, bread, a blanket. You can have it." She hesitated, then nodded once. Jackson dismounted slowly. He moved like he knew what fear looked like he had seen it before. He took the saddlebag and laid it on the ground between them, then stepped back. Savannah grabbed it and hurried inside. The moment Nolan smelled the food, he stirred. Nora sat up, her face pale but her hands alive with hunger. Savannah broke the bread into pieces, gave them each a share, then ate what was left. It was not much, but it was enough to stop the shaking in her limbs. She stepped outside again, holding the empty bag. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson McAllister," he said. "Folks call me Jack. I am Savannah Nolan." He nodded once. "You should not be out here, Savannah. That storm's getting worse, I know. There's a ranch 6 miles east. Mine. You and your children can come with me. Stay warm, eat real food, just until you figure out what's next." She stared at him. "I am not a man who lies," he said, steady, "and I will not touch you. You will have your own room. The children, too." She looked back toward the barn. Her children were huddled under the blanket now, asleep again. She had no other choice. And this man, his voice was quiet, his eyes were kind. "All right," she said at last. "We will come." The ride was slow. Nolan rode in front of Jackson, arms wrapped tight around the cowboy's coat. Nora sat behind Savannah on the borrowed horse Jackson had tethered nearby. The storm broke open over them, but Jackson led them down a path only he seemed to know, and by dusk they reached the ranch. The house was plain but solid. Whitewashed wood, a porch with a rocking chair, light glowing from the windows. It looked like safety. Inside, Jackson's house was warm and clean. He lit the stove and brought out a pot of stew already cooked. Savannah watched her children eat like they had never seen meat before. She sat quiet at the table, hands folded tight, until Jackson placed a bowl in front of her too. You need it just as much, he said. They stayed that night, and the next. By the third day, Savannah had washed her clothes, braided Nora's hair, and scrubbed the dirt from Nolan's face. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the prairie roll out in gold and wind. Jackson was outside, chopping wood with his sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow. "You watching him again?" Nora asked from the table, grinning. Savannah turned, cheeks warm. "Eat your bread." But she had been. Every time Jackson came inside, she noticed the way he looked at her, never too long, never with anything but respect, but it still stirred something deep in her chest she had not felt since before the war took her husband. On the fifth night, after the children were asleep and the storm had cleared, Savannah found herself on the porch. Jackson sat beside her, his elbows on his knees. "You came from the east," he asked. "Missouri. My husband died 2 years back. We were headed for Colorado. I thought there'd be work. Not many make that trip alone. I did not want to, but I had to," he nodded. "You got grit, your kids too." She looked over at him. "Why did you stop for us?" He glanced at her, then looked out at the stars. "My mother was left behind once, before I was born. A man helped her, gave her food, a roof. She always told me, if you see someone cold, feed them. If you see someone lost, ride to them." Savannah's voice was soft. "You did more than that." He met her eyes. "I would do it again." They sat in silence for a while until she leaned just a little closer. Not much, just enough, and he did not move away. Jackson rose before first light. He always had, even before the war. Chores came early, and habit didn't take kindly to change. He stepped outside into the chill, frost silvering the grass, air sharp enough to sting his lungs. The barn needed tending. The horses had to be fed. He moved through it all steady, boots crunching against the packed earth, his thoughts quiet. When he came back to the house, Savannah stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. She didn't look up as he entered, but she handed him a mug of coffee without a word, her hand brushing his just barely. He took it, sat at the table. Nora was sweeping the hearth with a broom that barely fit her hands, and Nolan sat propped on a stool, humming tunelessly to himself as he peeled potatoes with fierce concentration. The boy dropped one, and it thudded against the floor, rolling under the table. "Sorry," Nolan muttered. "You're doing fine," Savannah said gently. "Just pick it up and keep going." Jackson sipped his coffee and watched them move like they'd lived here longer than a week. Something about it settled warm in his chest. "There's a neighbor rides in every few days," he said after a while. "Name's Ruthie McKinnon. She keeps bees, brings honey and news. She'll be by this afternoon." Savannah's brow lifted. "Why are you telling me that?" "She talks a lot. Figured you ought to be prepared." That drew the faintest curve to her lips. "I can handle talk." He nodded, but said nothing more. Later, while Jackson repaired a broken hinge on the chicken coop, Ruthie came riding up with 2 jars of honey in her saddlebag and a string of stories already spilling from her mouth. She dismounted without waiting for invitation and marched straight toward Savannah, who was hanging sheets on the line. "You're the one Jackson took in," Ruthie said, eyes scanning her from boots to braid. "I suppose I am," Savannah replied, folding a wet sheet and laying it over the rope without pause. Ruthie squinted. "You look like you've seen fire and came out walking." "I've seen worse." "Good. This place needs someone who doesn't scare easy." Savannah didn't answer, just shook out another sheet. Nolan played in the dirt beside the porch, stacking sticks. Nora sat nearby with a slate, tracing letters with her finger. "Well," Ruthie said, softening just a bit. "I brought you this." She held out one of the jars. "Clover honey, my best batch." Savannah took it with both hands. "Thank you. I hear you're heading toward Colorado." "No longer." Ruthie tilted her head. "That's so." Savannah met her eyes. "We're staying." "For now." Ruthie gave a short nod and turned to go. "If you need anything, my place is 3 miles west. Just follow the creek till you see a red roof." Savannah watched her ride off. Jackson came up behind her, wiping his hands with a rag. "She's not as sharp as she seems," he said. "I didn't think she was dull," he half grinned. "You holding up? It's different here." "How so?" "Time feels slower, like it doesn't chase you." He looked at her then, really looked. "It doesn't have to." That evening, Jackson found Nora tracing words on the slate, brow furrowed in frustration. You want some help with that? She hesitated, then passed the slate over. Mama taught me letters, but I never learned more than a few. He crouched beside her. Well then. Let's start with this one. Savannah watched from the doorway. She said nothing, but her arms loosened across her chest and her shoulders eased. That night, after the children were in bed, she stepped out onto the porch again. Jackson was already there, sharpening a knife in slow, practiced strokes. She sat beside him, silent for a while. I was a midwife, she said at last. In Missouri, before everything changed. His hand stilled. You miss it. Some parts, not all, but I was good at it. I helped a lot of women live. You could do that here. Folks around need someone like you. I'd have to earn their trust. You already earned mine, she looked at him. Why? Because you keep trying even when you're bone tired. Because your children laugh now. Because you don't ask for anything but deserve more than you've been given. Savannah looked down at her hands. I don't know what to do with kindness. You don't have to do anything with it, he said quietly. Just let it be. They sat a while longer, the night cool around them. She didn't move closer and he didn't reach for her. But when she stood to go inside, her fingers brushed his shoulder, light as breath. He didn't look up, but he felt it. The hens had begun laying again. Jackson found the first egg nestled in the straw and held it up to the light filtering through the barn slats. He wiped it clean on his sleeve and tucked it into the basket, then glanced toward the house, where smoke curled from the chimney in a smooth, steady column. The air had lost its edge these past days, and the soil under his boots held the warmth of early November. Inside, Savannah was bent over the table, stitching the hem of a dress Nora had nearly outgrown. She didn't look up when Jackson came in, but her needle never paused. You've got more birds laying, he said, setting the basket near the flour barrel. I saw Nolan chase one under the porch, she replied. Might be another nest down there. I'll check it after supper. Don't want him crawling after it and getting stuck. Savannah tied off her thread and folded the fabric in her lap. He won't go far, not with Nora watching him like a hawk. She's sharp, like you. She's stronger than I was at her age. Jackson leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You think of staying past winter? Savannah studied the folded cloth. I've thought of it. His voice stayed low. You'd have work here if you wanted it. You've kept this place going better than I could have done alone. I'd need to earn my keep. You already have. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved to the window where fading sunlight lit the slope behind the barn. Then she stood and went to stir the beans on the stove. After the meal, Jackson lit a lantern and ducked under the porch to retrieve the second egg. Nolan followed close behind, belly down in the dust, watching with wide eyes. Is it warm? Nolan whispered. Still is, Jackson said, easing it into his pocket. Can I hold it? Not this one. It's thin-shelled, might not last the trip to your hands. The boy nodded solemnly, as though Jackson had just shared a great truth. Later, with the children down for the night, Savannah stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around her waist. Jackson stepped out and passed her a mug of tea. She took it without a word. I read something once, he said, eyes on the dark fields, said nothing grows right unless the roots can breathe. She sipped, not looking at him. You think I'm still buried? I think you're just now finding light. The wind stirred her skirt and she pulled the shawl tighter. That wagon driver left us with nothing. I'd never begged before, walking those miles with my children. I thought it would be the end of me. It wasn't. I didn't believe in kindness anymore. Jackson turned toward her. I don't give it for belief. She looked up, something unguarded passing through her face, not softness exactly, but the shape of something beginning. I've been thinking of offering to help Ruthie with her next birthing, she said. She lost her last one. She won't admit it, but she's still scared. I remember what that fear feels like, he nodded. She'll trust you. I'm not sure I trust myself yet. You will. Savannah stared into her tea, then drank the last of it and handed him the empty mug. Good night, Jackson. He stayed after she stepped inside, the door closing soft behind her. The wind had shifted. There was rain coming, but not tonight. In the morning, Savannah braided Nora's hair and sent her to help Ruthie gather hickory bark for dyeing cloth. Nolan took to Jackson's side in the shed, trailing behind him with a small hammer and a crooked smile. By mid-afternoon, Savannah stood in the yard with a basket of turnips, her cheeks pink from wind. Jackson watched her from across the pen, one glove tucked in his belt, his other hand resting on the gate. "You ever think about what you'd do if you had land of your own?" he asked. "I did once. You still should." She set the basket down and brushed her hands together. "This place feels like it's holding me without asking anything back." He stepped closer. "It's yours as much as it is mine. That's not how things work." "It could be." Savannah's gaze didn't drop. "You offering me a share of your land, Jackson McAllister? I'm offering you a place where no one walks away, where children don't go hungry, where you don't have to carry everything alone." She didn't speak, but her breath caught just enough for him to notice. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he added, "but I'd be proud to build a life with you, not just a roof and chores, a real life." Savannah stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. "If I say yes," she said, voice quiet, "it won't be because I need saving." He nodded. "It'll be because you're choosing it." She reached out, touched his chest with her fingertips, let them rest there a moment. "Then yes." Jackson covered her hand with his rough palm over her fine bones. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but the closeness held more than any promise spoken aloud. The wind shifted again. The air smelled of dry earth and pine. Behind them, the door creaked open and Nolan called out, "Mama, Ruthie brought sweetbread." Savannah smiled. "I'd better see to it before she gives him the whole loaf." As she walked back toward the house, Jackson stood alone for a moment longer, watching the woman who had come to him through storm and ruin, and who now walked as though she belonged. Snow came early that year, soft and quiet like a secret. It dusted the roof of the house and turned the pasture pale beneath the morning light. Savannah stood at the stove folding dough, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a thin sheen of flour on her forearms. Nolan sat nearby, watching her shape each biscuit with precise hands. Jackson had gone to the creek to check the traps he'd set the night before. Nora was at Ruthie's again, learning to card wool. The house held a stillness Savannah had come to rely on, the kind that didn't press against her, just waited. When the door eased open, Jackson stepped in with a red fox over his shoulder, its coat dense with winter fur. He hung it by the door and unwrapped his scarf. "Trap caught more ice than meat," he said, shaking snow from his hat. "But this'll trade well." Savannah placed the pan in the oven and closed the door. "I'll cure the hide. Ruthie said the tanner west of town's been short on pelts." "You've done that before," she nodded. "My father taught me. He was Choctaw, born near Tallahatchie. Only thing he ever kept from home was his bone knife and a way of working hides too soft for the market." Jackson watched her, something thoughtful moving behind his eyes. "You've never mentioned him." "I don't talk about Missouri much." "Not because I can't, just not sure what's worth carrying forward." "You still got the knife." Savannah reached for the shelf above the hearth and brought it down. The handle was worn smooth, the blade curved and dull at the tip. "I keep it close," she said, setting it gently on the table. "It's the only thing I didn't trade or lose." Jackson picked it up, turned it once in his hand, then passed it back. "You want to show Nora how to use it. If she wants to learn, she'll want to," he said, then added, "She watches everything you do." Savannah didn't answer right away. The biscuits were done, and she moved to pull them from the oven. She set them on a plate and slid one onto Nolan's tin dish. He grinned up at her, cheeks round with heat. "You ever think about teaching more?" Jackson asked. "Midwifery, curing hides, what you know about plants." "It's useful." "I've thought about it," she said, sitting across from him, "but it's different here. Women are careful about who they trust. They don't forget easily." "You've earned more than trust. I haven't asked for it." Jackson leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Maybe it's time you did." Savannah's fingers stilled on the edge of her cup. "You think I should become something again?" "I think you already have. You just haven't called it by name." She looked at him, the steam from the biscuits rising between them. "I was a wife before, I know. I didn't expect to be one again. I'm not asking for that today." Savannah stood, took the plate to the counter, and began wrapping the extras in cloth. "But you're asking." Jackson didn't move. "I'm offering." "You can take it when you're ready." Outside, the snow deepened. By dusk, it had blanketed the hills in white so clean it looked like the world had been reset. Nora returned with dyed yarn in her hands and color in her cheeks. She showed Nolan how to wind it around the posts of the bed frame, and he watched her like it was a magic trick. That night, as fire crackled low, Savannah sat in the rocker with her bare feet tucked beneath her, mending a tear in Jackson's shirt. He sat nearby, sanding the handle of a broken axe, his movements slow and steady. "You were right," she said without looking up. "About Nora, she take to the knife work. She's patient and she's cautious. I think she'll be better than I ever was." Jackson set the axe handle down. "You're building something here. So are you. Not without you." Savannah lowered the shirt into her lap. "If I stay as your wife, it won't be to fill a space that's empty. It'll be to build something new beside you." He met her eyes. "That's all I ever wanted." She set the shirt aside and stood, crossing to where he sat. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder and he turned into the touch. No words followed. They didn't need any. When she kissed him, it wasn't soft or uncertain. It was quiet, yes, but full of the weight she carried and the choice she'd made. His hand came to her waist, warm and steady, grounding her in the here and now. Later, she lay awake beside him beneath the quilt Ruthie had gifted them, the one stitched from scraps of wool dyed in goldenroot and walnut bark. Snow tapped the windows. Nolan's breath rose and fell in the room just beyond. Savannah turned toward Jackson and laid her hand over his. "We'll need to build another room come spring," she said softly. "Nora's growing fast." Jackson's thumb moved once over her knuckles. "We'll build whatever you need." She let her eyes fall shut, and for the first time in years, she didn't brace herself for what came next. There was no next storm pressing at the door, no hunger curling in her belly, no man who would vanish at dawn, only the quiet breath of a man who had offered her home and a place to begin again. Savannah sat cross-legged on the floor beside Nora, guiding her daughter's hand through a stitch along the hem of a wool wrap. The girl's tongue poked out in concentration, her brow furrowed as she slid the needle through, careful not to tug too tight. "Good," Savannah murmured. "But ease your pull on the last loop." Nora adjusted, eyes flicking up for a moment. "Will Ruthie pay for this one?" She already did. "With a bushel of dried apples and some lamp oil, but the next one will be yours to trade." Nora's face lit with quiet pride. Across the room, Jackson poured water into a basin, steam rising faint off the surface. He placed it on the table and began washing the soot from his arms after repairing the stove pipe. Nolan knelt by the hearth, stacking kindling the way Savannah had shown him, his small fingers deliberate as he built a pyramid from bark slivers. The house had begun to feel fuller in ways that didn't show in the walls or beams. It was in the way the floor held warmth under bare feet, or how the air inside carried the scent of dried herbs and wool instead of emptiness. Jackson dried his hands and turned toward Savannah. "You hear from that woman down near the river bend, Mrs. Harlan. She sent word through Ruthie. Wants me to come look in on her daughter. First child, swelling in the legs. You planning to go?" "I am, tomorrow morning." "You want me to come with you?" Savannah met his eyes. "You'd ride all that way just to wait outside?" "I'd ride all that way to make sure you got there and back safe." She nodded once. "Then I'd like that." The next morning, Savannah saddled the mare while Jackson packed bread and dried meat into a canvas bag. Nora stayed behind with Ruthie, helping to card wool for the next dye bath. Nolan clung to Savannah's waist before she mounted up, and she bent to kiss the crown of his head. The ride to the Harlan homestead took them through low hills where the snow had thinned, revealing the winter yellow grass beneath. They passed a rusted fence line and a tree split by lightning, its blackened trunk hollow but still standing. Savannah spoke little on the ride out, her mind focused on the symptoms Ruthie had described. Jackson didn't fill the silence. He never did, unless words were needed. When they arrived, Mrs. Harlan brought them inside, her eyes red at the corners from worry. The daughter, barely more than a girl, lay on a straw-stuffed mattress, her ankles swollen, skin pale as linen. Savannah knelt beside her, took careful measure of her pulse, listened to her breath, asked questions no one had thought to answer. "She'll deliver early," Savannah said after a long while. But I think she'll be all right if she stays off her feet and drinks that willow bark tea I'll leave with you." Mrs. Harlan nodded, pressing her hands to her mouth. "I'll ride back in a week to check on her," Savannah added. "Tell her not to fight the rest." Outside, Jackson waited by the fence with the horses. Savannah stepped beside him, rubbing her arms against the wind. "She's young," she said, "but steady. I think she'll be all right. You look tired." "I've done more for less." They mounted and rode home as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the open land. When they reached the ranch, Ruthie was waiting with Nolan curled in her lap and Nora asleep on a blanket beside the stove. "He's been asking for you since noon," Ruthie said, standing and brushing off her skirt. "And he wouldn't nap unless I hummed that song you sing about the plow horse and the moon." Savannah smiled faintly. "Thank you." Ruthie waved her off. "I've rocked harder children." After Ruthie left, Jackson lit the lanterns while Savannah settled Nolan into bed. Nora stirred but didn't wake. The house had gone quiet again, not with absence but with peace. Savannah stood in the kitchen, her hands braced on the counter. Jackson came up behind her, not touching, just waiting. She turned. "I want to make it official." He tilted his head. "You said once you'd be proud to build a life with me. I want that, not someday, now. I want to be your wife." Jackson didn't speak, but he reached out and took her hand, lifting it slowly until his lips pressed against her knuckles. Then he looked at her, and the answer was in his eyes long before he said it. "We'll speak to the circuit preacher when he rides through next week," he said. "I'll cut a ring from the red oak in the back pasture. That tree's been through fire and drought, still stands. I don't need a ring." "I know. But I want to give you one anyway." She stepped into him, her arms finding their way around his back. His breath warmed her neck, and she let herself rest fully against him for the first time without bracing. The week passed in quiet preparation. Savannah wrote letters to 2 women she knew needed help with their pregnancies, offering to bring herbs and instruction. Jackson built a frame for a second bed, one strong enough to last Nora through her next growth. Nolan followed him around the yard with a stick he called his measuring rod, poking at fence posts and declaring them right tall enough. When the preacher finally arrived, it was a gray morning with frost on the porch rail and the fire already burning low in the oven. Jackson had combed his hair, and Savannah wore the only dress she hadn't altered. They said their vows with Nora standing between them and Nolan tugging on Jackson's coat. Ruthie acted as witness, her eyes bright but dry. Afterward, Jackson laid his hand gently on Savannah's back as they stepped outside, and she leaned into the touch like it was already familiar. That night, with the children asleep and the wind quiet beyond the windows, Savannah sat on the edge of their bed and removed the ribbon from her hair. Jackson watched her, his hand resting on the quilt he'd sewn from worn shirts and feed sacks. "You ever think," she said, voice low, "about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped at that barn?" "No," he said, "because it doesn't matter what could have been. Only what is." She turned toward him. "And what is?" He reached for her hand. "You're here, we're whole, that's everything." She leaned in and kissed him, slow and sure, her fingers curling into the edge of his collar. And when they finally lay down together, it wasn't with urgency or hesitation, but with the kind of trust that had been earned one small act at a time. The snow melted come March, and the land breathed again. Savannah planted herbs beside the porch, roots gifted from Ruthie and others she'd dug herself. Jackson added a second stall to the barn. Nora began writing letters for Ruthie, who had never learned her letters, and Nolan broke a button off Jackson's coat trying to sew his own. They built that life together, steady, real, with work and laughter and earth beneath their nails, and every night when the fire burned low and the world went quiet, Savannah reached for Jackson's hand beneath the quilt and found it waiting for hers. Always.